بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ارفع البلاء وسهل علينا وثبت أقدامنا ونصلي ونسلم على الذي أرسلته بالهدى ودين الحق. We wanted to open up a conversation given the fact that there's been a lot of back and forth with regard to how to handle ourselves in this situation that we are confronting globally. One of the issues that we need to consider is the issue that there's been a lot of masajid that have canceled the Jumu'ah Salah and even other activities in which there's large groups. Some people have looked upon that as being antithetical to having a firm belief in Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Some people have looked at that issue as having a defect in your belief. One of the things that becomes problematic is that there was a time period, especially in the West, where the issue of the Jumu'ah Salah, not actually even only in the West, globally, whether the issue of the Jumu'ah Salah was an obligation in the absence of a Khalifa. And then that type of discussion kind of eased itself out and people began to mediate the situation by basically understanding that the absence of a Khalifa doesn't necessarily entail the absence of the Jumu'ah Salah. You have debates in the fiqh books, whether Maliki or Hanafi, with regard to the number of people that are necessary in order to make a jama'ah, or whether a community is necessary, or whether a jam'i masjid is necessary. Jam'i masjid means a massive congregational masjid. Whether salah is obligatory upon those who are in the rural communities versus those who are in larger communities. What about if you're on your own and there is no way for you to get to Jumu'ah and so on and so forth? So there's different conversations that take place in the fiqh with regard to when is it that it becomes an obligation to go to the Jumu'ah Salah. We know that there's textual evidence that talks about missing the Jumu'ah Salah consecutively and the spiritual issues that ensue from that. But the reality of the situation is that some confuse. This is where now people are turning to the objectives of the Sharia, and they're saying that preservation of deen trumps everything. We have objectives in Islam. Islam comes to fulfill certain objectives. Of those objectives is preservation of the way of life that is called Islam, preservation of life, preservation of intellect, preservation of family, preservation of dignity, of wealth. And the ulama, they debate with regard to the order of those objectives. I switched up some of the objectives in terms of the natural order. They debate whether there's an order to those objectives. Is it the case that preservation of deen trumps everything in every circumstance? Do we have examples in which life, for instance, when it's threatened, in the case of a person that's famished, that they're allowed to drink alcohol in order to preserve their lives or his or her life? In the situation in which that person is facing death, that person is allowed to violate the prohibition in the deen, which prohibits alcohol itself. When we look at the objectives of the Sharia, we have an understanding that there's no ability to practice Islam if a person doesn't meet certain conditions. Of those conditions is that person be of age, maturity, be Muslim, sane. In other words, you can't force Islam on others. You have to, in other words, you have to be mature intellectually and physically in order for you to be considered to be obligated. But what about if there's no life? What about if you're dead? Are you able to practice the deen if you're dead? And so, there's a presumption there that you have to be alive in order to be able to practice the deen. And so even the ulama, they go into discussions such as, for instance, are you liable for practicing Islam if you are asleep? Or for instance, if you're in a coma, are you sinful if you don't fulfill your obligations? And no one is going to tell you that you're sinful in that regard, because we have a textual evidence which says that responsibility is lifted, the pen is lifted from those people, right, who fall under those types of circumstances. And that's the indication of the hadith. And so the issue comes here that if we're in a situation where life is threatened, no one wants to be in a position where basics of your life are altered. But if life itself is threatened, right, if you jeopardize the life of the elder that comes to the masjid, Salat al-Fajr, on a frequent basis, because you feel strong and that person may have multiple conditions, and you come and you contaminate the masjid area and you pass on a sickness to that person. No one wants to be in a situation where we have to separate ourselves from each other. Anyone that is in a healthy state of mind understands the value of human interaction, understands the value of just congregating. And then, there's the spiritual element to that. That there's no doubt that Islam in its practice is communal. And so it's very alienating to take that away from people, especially those who have the masjid as their centerpiece. Some may not be able to have the masjid as their centerpiece because of work and how distant they are. But here we begin to question where some of the Muslims are at, not from the angle of their commitment to the deen, because some people have a commitment to the deen even if it means that they have to sacrifice from themselves. In that aspect, there's a beauty to that. That we have a group of people that regardless of what's going on, they still want to be committed to Salatul Jama'at, and they still want to be committed to the masjid, they still want to be committed to the congregational prayer. But the issue that comes to the fore here is that even if you take on that role that no matter what happens to me, I'll still commit to the Salah. To say that the whole of the population should go in that direction, if it means the spread of an illness and it means that more and more people will fall ill and those people may be vulnerable, and then that taxes the rest of the society by taxing the healthcare system, by putting people under a situation that's problematic. If you take that mindset, then basically you're contributing to the weakening of the whole of the society. And I'm not necessarily for 100% stringent measures, which some people are talking about implementing at the level of government to control people's behaviors in this regard. Even there's some articles now that are being published that are kind of suggesting that, these types of draconian control measures should be put in place. I'm not suggesting that we, go that route. I think that's extremely problematic. But if you look at a place like, for instance, the continent of Africa with the Ebola and other major viruses that were hitting, you can't necessarily say that there's no need to alter our behavior. And so, for instance, if we don't take in balance the fact that Allah Ta'ala gave us reason and revelation, we begin to undermine and undercut Islam itself. That's problematic. The Muslims used to be at the lead of scientific investigation and the evolution and expansion of scientific knowledge. And now some of the opinions that emerge begin to be very anti-scientific. And I understand the skepticism, and I understand the concern and the worry and everything that comes along with the type of environment that we live in, or the types of environments that we live in. But there has to be a way, you know what I'm saying, that we balance out science and reason and revelation, right? And so that, in this case, we know that germs have an impact. There's no doubt about that. And so then the issue becomes, what are the precautionary measures to be taken to secure, right, that we strike a balance between our practice and the safety overall of the community? Because that's what we're talking about at this point. We're talking about the safety of the community, the public health, right? And there has to be a balance between that. It's not 100% productive to go tit for tat with each other from the angle of whose iman is stronger and who's holding on to the deen in the most strong way, so to speak. Like we're more brave, we're more strong, we're more this, we're more that. And then those who take precautionary measures, you know, then they're not considered to be people of iman or people of stable faith. There's no doubt that before an operation, a doctor is obligated to wash up and to clean up. Why is that the case? Why is that the case? You know, why doesn't the doctor just perform a surgery or whatever, you know, after going to the bathroom or after touching whatever surfaces? You just go and you perform the surgery. That's because taking the means, it becomes important. Allah Ta'ala gave us knowledge on multiple fronts. Allah Ta'ala created the universe and gave us an intellect and gave us a community to be able to try to unravel what we call the sunan, or the laws of the way that the universe operates, the way that nature operates. And so there's things that are discoverable and things that are to be discovered, and there's knowledge that's more accurate and there's knowledge that's accurate. And so we don't jettison or throw out our understanding of how the world functions necessarily. There may be better explanations or better theories, or there may be a better approach to things. But if we have knowledge, and if we know that germs contaminate, and if we know that germs pass on to each other and create contagion and so on and so forth, then we take the means to be able to protect the well-being of the community overall. But some people are taking the issue of making this an Aqidah point or a Tawheed point beyond the extreme. As a matter of fact, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayhi in the treatise Ubudiyya brought an issue to the fore that was similar to this. The issue of Umar telling the people that were going to go into Syria not to enter it because there was an epidemic, there was a sickness. And so Ibn Taymiyyah in the Ubudiyya, he uses that position of Umar, in which Umar prohibits the people from going in, to talk about qadr itself, to talk about qadr and free will and taking the means. And so Umar himself was questioned, are you running from the qadr of Allah? And he said, no, we run from the qadr of Allah to the qadr of Allah, meaning that not going into Syria at that time period where the people were suffering illness, that's not running from the qadr of Allah. That's not being scared of the qadr of Allah. But what it is taking the means, and by taking the means is part of the qadr of Allah also. So, we have to balance out. And so this shows a deficiency in how we deal with science in today's time. And it's unfortunate because the Muslims used to be at the forefront. And we keep making things a debate with regard to the issue of Tawheed and Shirk. And where we're lacking at in this case is a balance between revelation and reason. Should we be concerned about the legal implications of having our behavior restricted and so on and so forth? We should. But at the same time, we should be concerned with the issue of the well-being of others. Should we be concerned about our deen being distorted, our way of life being distorted, our practice, our worship being distorted? Sure, we should. But at the same time that people have that level of concern for the deen itself, they should have concern for others, because that's part of the deen, that's part of Iman. How can you not have concern for others in that regard? And so the reality of the situation is that this is a hard time that we're living in right now. And we actually don't know where this is going. And I've been staying quiet on a lot of fronts. And I keep mentioning this when I do talk. The economic fallout of this is going to be felt by many of us. The economic fallout is going to be felt by many of us. And it could be proven to be more problematic than the situation that we're in right now. Because when people are not able to pay their rent and their mortgage and their cars and this and that, and they end up having those things of stability taken away from them, that creates another situation which is dire. So we have two fronts. We have the medical front and the economic front. Both of those are open. And now some of us are opening up the spiritual front. That's extremely problematic. This is not a time to argue, with regard to the deen. This is a time to regard human life. There's a basic point here. If there's no life, if there's no health, there's no practice of the deen. If people become mentally unstable because of their situations, if people become physically sick because of their situations, right? There's not going to be any salah. If people die because of this situation, there's not going to be any congregational prayer. There's not going to be any practice of the deen in that regard. And so that's why the ulama, some of them, they debate with regard to whether there is even an order to the maqasid of the sharia or the objectives of the sharia. And in some cases you see, like in the case of the person drinking alcohol, the human life drinking alcohol in the situation in which the person is famished and there's nothing else to drink it except alcohol in order for that person to stay alive. We see in that example where life is given precedence. The salvation of life is given precedence. As a matter of fact, some of the ulama, they say that it's sinful for that person if they were not to drink alcohol in that situation in which they're famished and they're about to die. And some of them say, they talk about how much should the person drink. Some of them say enough to stay alive. And then some of them even go beyond that. Enough to sustain, not just stay alive, but enough to sustain. And so the scholars of depth and breadth, they had an understanding of the role of dignity in life. And so what we should be talking about more so is how we're going to organize ourselves to deal with the crisis. What we should be talking about is what kind of services can we put in place. What we should be talking about is how can we support the poor who are going to suffer from this situation. What we should be talking about is how would we do Salat al-Janazah in these situations that are arising. What we should be talking about is how, will we bury the people in large numbers, and what is the fiqh of that, if that were to be the case, that it were to happen in these areas that we're in. In other words, being prepared. And this is one of the benefits of the fiqh of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, that he had a concern for the future, a foresight and a concern for the future. And so that's something that we look at, and something that we, have to consider. One of the things about the fiqh of Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi was the issue of weighing harm and benefit. Masalih nas, or masalih nas. That's something that is very important. What is within the interest and well-being of people. Because that's what Islam comes to. It comes to uplift people. It's not a deen or a way of life of rules. It's a deen of principles and values, and the rules guide us. And if the rules violate the objectives or the very core values of the Sharia, then those rules may even be suspended for some time. Some people may take that to task, but that's a reality. You know what I'm saying? And in this case, human life is important. Human life is important, and so people need to have their priorities straight with that regard. I don't see the same type of clamor talking about how we're going to deal with the elderly in our community, that their lives are fragile. How are we going to deal with those who are out of work now? How are we going to deal with those who may be homeless? I don't hear any conversations on that point. This is why, in many regards, I have pulled back, and have been trying to be silent on a lot of issues, because the thinking is not correct. It's not a thinking of leadership. It's not a thinking of leadership. And then at the end of the day, people are going to have to take care of their families. And they're going to have to try to take care of the community while taking care of their families. And so there's a balance that has to be struck in all of this. We will be disoriented, and that's okay. But it's not okay to stay there. It's not okay to stay there. And so then we, in that type of orientation, we have to learn how to work through our own Iman issues. And I'm not talking about Iman issues like from the angle of questioning people's Iman, but it's more Iman issues and learning how to apply the deen in a situation which is extremely chaotic, right? We don't know where all of this is going. There's so many unknowns. So using dhikr, using dua, using encouraging statements, using the recitation of the Quran, not as an escape, but as a way to cope, as a way to manage, as a way to deal, as a way to navigate. And then the same thing when it comes to the fiqh, using the fiqh in a way to empower the community, not in a way to stifle the community and to hold it back and to make the situation difficult for people. And so some people are coming out as though they can handle the situation overall. And I wonder if the bodies start dropping around them. When you start having people with multiple complications, when they start falling ill, will they still have that same mentality, or now will they be rushing to the hospital? None of us likes to be restricted in our freedoms. There's no doubt about that. But this is not an issue necessarily of freedom. This is the issue of regarding others, right? And so that's basically, that's something that we have to think about. Let's not make this an issue of who has a stronger deen than the other person, but let's make this a discussion of how does the deen deal with scientific issues, and how does the deen deal with the deen, meaning Islam, how does it deal with life or death issues and public health issues and community well-being and so on and so forth. And that's a better discussion, even if we have a debate. But when we start to question people's Iman, that becomes extremely problematic. And this shows that there's no balance between Iman and reason and understanding the world around us. And that is not the way of the scholars of the past. When you look at Al-Andalus and other places, that was something that was extremely important, to have a balance between those realities. And of the biggest balance is, understanding what it is that we have to do with regard to dealing with medical issues, in light of faith. And we leave on that note. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.